We're not just making videos, we're rebuilding lost history, one subscriber at a time. Join us. 20 kilometers of water separate two continents at their closest point. At the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, Africa and Arabia narrow down to a gap you could cross in an afternoon, if the currents let you. Roughly 60,000 years ago, sea levels dropped low enough during the last glacial period that this gap narrowed even further, and researchers studying the southern coastal route model of early human migration consider this exact stretch of water the leading candidate for how our species first left Africa. By most population genetic models, the ancestors of every non-African person alive today funneled through this one narrow gate. Not several scattered crossings. Not multiple routes tested over centuries. One strait, one exit, one origin point for the genetic diversity of two continents that followed. That's the clean version of the story. Here's what breaks it. The people who still live at that exact gate today do not carry a clean signature of departure. Their DNA holds a large, well-documented block of ancestry that scientists have traced flowing in the opposite direction, back into Africa, thousands of years after the Exodus was supposed to be finished business. The gate didn't just let people out. Something came back through it, and it left a mark that geneticists are still arguing about today. If this exact strait is where our species left Africa 60,000 years ago, why does the DNA of the people who still live there carry ancestry that moved the opposite direction? That gate has a name. Djibouti, wedged into the junction of the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea, barely larger than the state of Massachusetts, sitting directly across the water from Yemen. Two population groups dominate the country's ethnic map: the Isa, a Somali clan from the Deer lineage; the Afar, sometimes called the Danakil, spread across the volcanic lowlands that stretch into Ethiopia and Eritrea. Both speak Cushitic languages. Both belong to the wider Afro-Asiatic language family. Both are described, in nearly every general history you can find, as indigenous Horn of Africa peoples with roots stretching back millennia before any outside contact ever arrived. Even the colonial paperwork encodes the story. France first administered this territory as French Somaliland, then renamed it the French territory of the Afars and the Isas, before independence finally arrived in 1977. Two names, two peoples, one place. The label itself assumed the two-group, purely indigenous version of history was already settled fact, and nobody thought to argue with it. Layer on the lifestyle, and the story only gets more solid. Camel herding across the lowlands, goat herding on what little grazing land exists. Seasonal movement through the scorched terrain of the Danakil, time to wherever water can still be found. Salt caravans crossing the same routes their grandfathers crossed, and their grandfathers before them. Islam arrives early here too. Most historians place the region's conversion somewhere in the 7th to 9th centuries CE, carried by Arabian trade contact across that same narrow strait. But that contact gets filed under religion and culture. Not biology, not blood, just belief, crossing water, and staying on the surface of a population that was already there. Then there's memory itself, formalized. Somali Abtirsi genealogies, oral lineage chains that trace a person's ancestry back generation by generation, sometimes 20 or 30 names deep. And Afar clan structures built the same way, both presented as unbroken threads tying every living person back to local Horn ancestors. No gaps in the chain, no outside insertions, no foreign names slipped in among the local ones, just a continuous line, spoken and re-spoken, father to son, for as long as anyone has bothered to count. This is the version taught almost everywhere you look. Two ancient peoples, one ancient land, a history with no seams in it at all. Except when geneticists actually opened up the DNA, one number refused to fit that story at all. Here is where it gets complicated. In 2012, geneticist Luca Pagani and his colleagues published a study in the American Journal of Human Genetics titled "Ethiopian Genetic Diversity Reveals Linguistic Stratification and Complex Influences on the Ethiopian Gene Pool." The team wasn't looking to overturn anyone's oral history. They were sequencing genomes, population by population, across the Horn of Africa, running the same kind of ancestry analysis used to trace immigration patterns anywhere else on Earth. What they found didn't match the ancient, unbroken, purely local story at all. Afro-Asiatic-speaking populations across the Horn, the same broad genetic family Djibouti's Isa and Afar both belong to, carry a strikingly high proportion of non-African, Eurasian-derived ancestry. In some Horn populations, that figure climbs into the 40 to 50% range. Compare that to the rest of sub-Saharan Africa, where non-African admixture in most populations sits under 5%, and the anomaly becomes obvious. This wasn't a rounding error. This was nearly half of a population's deep ancestry pointing somewhere else entirely. The study modeled this as a distinct back migration event, a population movement out of the Levant or the Arabian Peninsula, back into the Horn of Africa, dated by the authors to roughly 3,000 years before the present. 3,000 years is not ancient by the standards of human migration out of Africa. It's recent. It's within shouting distance of written history, of named kingdoms, of trade records that still partly survive. For context, the original out-of-Africa exodus through that same strait happened somewhere in the range of 60,000 years ago. This back migration signal is dated at roughly 1/20th of that age. In genetic terms, that's not deep history. That's practically yesterday, layered thinly on top of a much older foundation, and it's thin enough that it shows up clearly against the older signal instead of blending into it. The Y chromosome data sharpened the picture further. Researchers have documented an elevated frequency of haplogroup J1. Think of a Y chromosome haplogroup as a genetic surname, a marker passed down father to son largely unchanged for thousands of years, letting researchers trace a single paternal line back through deep time, across Horn of Africa populations, including Somali and Afar groups. J1 is a lineage strongly associated with the Arabian Peninsula and the wider Near East. Its presence here isn't background noise, it's a signature. The mitochondrial evidence tells a matching story down the maternal line. Haplogroup M1, passed from mother to child largely unaltered, like a genetic thread that never changes hands, turns up in Horn of Africa populations at frequencies that are anomalously high compared to the rest of sub-Saharan Africa. M1 carries deep Eurasian roots. Its presence in local maternal lineages means this wasn't a one-directional trickle carried by a handful of traders passing through. It moved through both parental lines, generation after generation, embedding itself into the core of the population. Add it up, and the scale becomes hard to ignore. A population widely described in every textbook and every oral genealogy as indigenous, unbroken, purely African is, at the genomic level, close to half not of African in deep ancestry terms. Not by a little, not at the margins, close to half. The clan genealogies weren't lying exactly. The Abtirsi chains, the Afar lineage structures, the sense of an unbroken local identity, none of that was fabricated, it just wasn't the whole picture. Social memory tracked names, alliances, land, and belonging with real accuracy. It was never built to track chromosomes. An entire second population layer folded itself into the Horn of Africa's genetic record thousands of years ago, and none of the oral history was designed to notice it, because it wasn't designed to measure biology at all. It was designed to measure belonging. Scientists broadly agree that something crossed back over that strait roughly 3,000 years ago. Researchers are careful to frame this as a matter of probability and modeling, not settled fact carved in stone. Ancient DNA work always carries margins of error, confidence intervals, competing data sets. But on the core direction of the signal, the field is not divided. Something came back through the gate. What they don't agree on is why. There are two competing explanations for what actually happened at that strait, and the first one has a problem. The first theory says it started with incense, not invasion. Pagani and his colleagues modeled the back migration as linked to the expansion of Semitic-speaking agro-pastoralist groups moving out of the Arabian Peninsula, across the Red Sea, into the Horn of Africa. That same era lines up neatly with the spread of Semitic languages into the Ethiopian highlands, languages ancestral to Ge'ez, and later to Amharic and Tigrinya, still spoken by tens of millions of people today. The timing also lines up with the height of the frankincense and myrrh trade, the legendary land of punt routes that connected the Horn of Africa to Arabia, to Egypt, and to the wider ancient trading world stretching as far as Mesopotamia. Merchants moving resin and spice across a narrow strait, generation after generation, don't just trade goods. Over enough centuries, they trade genes. The dating attached to this theory sits at approximately 3,000 years before the present, with the study's confidence interval stretching across a window of roughly 2,500 to 4,000 years. That's a wide window, but a bounded one, old enough to predate colonial contact by millennia, recent enough to sit within reach of recorded trade history. Under this model, the mechanism is straightforward. Small groups of Arabian traders and agro-pastoralists cross the strait, settle along the coast, intermarry into local populations, and their descendants carry a growing share of that Eurasian ancestry with each generation. Repeat that pattern over dozens of generations, along one of the most active trade corridors of the ancient world, and a modest starting population can leave a genetic footprint that shows up centuries later at levels of 40% or more. It's not a single invasion. It's compound interest, paid out over 100 generations of intermarriage along a trade route that never stopped moving. But the theory has a limitation, and it's not a small one. This Semitic trader model was built primarily around Semitic-speaking populations in the Ethiopian highlands, the very people whose language history lines up with the timeline. Djiboutis, Isa, and Afar are not Semitic speakers. They speak Cushitic languages, a different branch of the Afro-Asiatic family entirely, with no direct linguistic link to the incense trade migrants the theory describes. And yet Cushitic-speaking Isa and Afar communities carry comparably high levels of that same non-African ancestry component. Language and genetics simply do not line up cleanly here, and a simple story about Semitic traders crossing the Red Sea for spice cannot fully account for it. If this was just one wave of Semitic-speaking traders 3,000 years ago, it doesn't explain why Cushitic-speaking Afar and Isa communities, who never spoke that language, never left behind that trade history, never wrote themselves into that particular chapter, carry the same genetic signal, at comparable strength, sitting in their DNA today. Which means the real explanation might be older than anyone initially modeled. Older, and considerably more complicated than a single crossing of traders 3,000 years ago. Older, and considerably more complicated because when researchers went looking for what a single trade-era wave couldn't explain, they found a second wave hiding underneath the first one. The second theory doesn't start with incense at all. It starts more than 10,000 years earlier. In 2014, a team led by Jason Hodgson, working with Connie Mulligan, Ali Almiri, and Ryan Raham, published a study in PLOS Genetics titled Early Back to Africa Migration into the Horn of Africa. Instead of treating the Eurasian ancestry signal as one single event, the team broke it apart, looking for structure inside the structure. What they found was a distinct genetic component they named Ethio-Somali, separate from, and considerably older than, the Semitic-linked signal Pagani's team had dated to 3,000 years ago. Think of a coalescence date the way a genealogist thinks of a common ancestor on a family tree. It's the estimated point in time where two branches of DNA last shared a single source, calculated backward from how much the branches have since diverged. Run that calculation on the Ethio-Somali component, and the branches don't meet 3,000 years ago. They meet somewhere between 15 and 23,000 years ago, tied to population expansions out of Arabia in the aftermath of the last glacial maximum, when shifting climates pushed groups to move in search of livable land. That number changes everything about the shape of the story. This isn't one clean, 3,000-year-old trade migration anymore. It's potentially two separate back-to-Africa pulses, separated from each other by more than 10,000 years, both layered into the same modern populations, both showing up in the same DNA samples pulled from the same villages today. And this older pulse fits the Cushitic-speaking Isa and Afar far better than the Semitic trader model ever did. Their non-African ancestry may trace mostly to this earlier, deeper wave, one that predates the spread of Semitic languages by over 10 millennia. Which means the tidy incense trade story from a moment ago wasn't wrong, it just wasn't the whole story, and it may not even be the larger part of it. The recent Arabian trader explanation still holds for some of the signal. But the deeper, older layer may account for more of it, and it's roughly 12,000 years older than the trade routes anyone had originally pointed to. Scientists studying this region are no longer just debating when this crossing happened. They're debating how many times it happened. Two waves, thousands of years apart, both pointing back across the same narrow strait. But there's a third possibility on the table, one that some researchers are far more hesitant to say out loud, because it would mean the entire back migration framing might be built on a shaky premise. What if the signal was never a migration at all? What if it's something closer to a memory the reference data itself was never built to read? The third theory, and the one most researchers are careful not to overstate, doesn't argue against back migration outright. It argues that some portion of that non-African signal may not be non-African at all. Some population geneticists have raised the possibility that part of what gets labeled Eurasian ancestry actually reflects ancient population structure that survived inside Africa itself, dating back to the deep Pleistocene, long before anyone crossed any strait in either direction. Here's the logic, stripped down. Early human populations across Africa were never one uniform group. Deeply divergent lineages coexisted across the continent for tens of thousands of years before eventually mixing back together. The problem is how modern Ancestry software is built. Reference panels typically compare a sample against a limited menu of modern African and non-African populations. If an ancient, purely African lineage diverged early enough and stayed distinct long enough, that software can misread it. It can flag deep internal African divergence as if it were outside admixture, simply because there's no clean reference population in the database that represents it correctly. This connects to a much bigger debate playing out in paleogenomics right now, sometimes called the African multi-regional model, championed in various forms by researchers including Eleanor Seri and colleagues, who argue that modern humans didn't emerge from one single population in one clean location, but from a patchwork of interconnected, semi-isolated African groups that periodically mixed and separated over hundreds of thousands of years. Researchers have not yet published Horn of Africa-specific data directly testing this framework against the ESA and AFAR signal. This remains a live, open question rather than settled analysis. Here is where it's worth being honest about the limits of the science. Most specialists working on the Horn of Africa still favor the back migration model over the ancient structure model. The evidence for actual Arabian-linked ancestry, particularly the Y chromosome and mitochondrial signatures, remains strong. But the debate over exactly how much of the region's Eurasian signal is genuinely external versus how much might be ancient internal African structure misread by modern reference panels is active, unresolved, and in some academic circles, contentious. Nobody in this field is claiming a final answer. Researchers are careful to frame even the dominant model as the best current explanation, not a closed case. Whichever explanation eventually wins out, one place tied to this story holds a claim even stranger than any of the theories argued so far. Because this same stretch of land was never just a place where modern humans may have left or returned. It may be where the human story itself first stood upright. Picture the edge of the Gulf of Tadjoura at dawn, the water flat and pale before the heat sets in for the day. This gulf has functioned as a gateway for millennia. A historic port linking Djibouti's coast to Yemen, and the Arabian shoreline visible, on a clear day, across the strait. Inland, the ground drops away entirely. Lake Assal sits roughly 155 meters below sea level, the lowest point on the entire African continent. Its surface, a blinding white sheet of salt, formed by evaporation so extreme that almost nothing survives at its edges. The heat here isn't seasonal, it's structural, built into the geography itself. For centuries, Afar caravans have crossed this exact terrain, camel trains loaded with slabs of raw salt cut straight from the lakebed, following routes passed down and repeated for generations, linking the volcanic interior to coastal ports that have taken in traders for just as long. Two of those ports carry names that show up again and again in the region's trade history: Tadjoura and Zayla, both significant crossing points for the old incense trade, and later for the Islamic-era commerce that followed it across these same waters. Nearby sits the Danakil Depression, one of the hottest, lowest, and most geologically volatile places on the planet. Positioned directly on a tectonic triple junction, where three of the Earth's plates are slowly tearing apart from one another, millimeter by millimeter, year after year. Standing here, the ground itself is unstable in the most literal sense. This is a landscape still being made, not one that finished forming and simply sat still. Stand at that junction of salt flat, strait, and fault line, and you are standing in two places simultaneously. Africa is under your feet. Arabia is visible, or at least felt, across the water. This ground has watched people leave Africa, and it has watched people come back. But it turns out this same stretch of Earth holds something even older than either direction of that crossing. Proof of where the human story may have first begun standing upright at all. Here is where the story stops being only about genes and starts being about bone. Zoom out far enough and the picture reorganizes itself completely. In 1974, paleoanthropologist Donald Johanson, working at Hadar in Ethiopia's Afar region, the same Afar homeland whose people stretch into modern Djibouti, uncovered the partial skeleton that would become known as Lucy, a specimen of Australopithecus afarensis, dated to roughly 3.2 million years old. Not 3,000 years, not 23,000 years, 3.2 million. Push further back, and the same region keeps producing older evidence still. In 2009, a team led by Tim White, publishing in the journal Science, described Ardipithecus ramidus, unearthed at Aramis, also within the Afar region, dated to approximately 4.4 million years old, extending the hominin record in this exact territory more than 1 million years further back than Lucy alone. Then bring the timeline forward again, closer to the present. In 2005, geologist Ian McDougall and colleagues, publishing in Nature, redated the Omo Kibish remains from southern Ethiopia to approximately 195,000 years old, making them among the oldest confirmed anatomically modern human fossils found anywhere on the planet. Here is where the reframe lands. The same population currently being debated over a genetic signal dated somewhere between 3,000 and 23,000 years old, is rooted, physically, in a landscape holding multi-million-year-old evidence of the human lineage's own origin point. Millions of years of hominin evolution on one end, a few thousand years of contested back migration on the other. Both true, both real, neither one canceling the other out, not African or Arabian. Both, layered, unresolved. Both. This was never a simple binary of one identity against another. It's a population sitting at the compounding intersection of the oldest hominin evidence discovered anywhere on Earth, and one of the most contested recent migration signals in modern population genetics. Two timelines that happen to occupy the exact same patch of ground, separated from each other by nearly 3 million years, both still legible in the DNA of people alive today. And a far elder, interviewed by researchers working in the region, once described his own family's Abtirsi lineage the way most elders do, recited from memory, name by name, reaching back further than any document in his household. He wasn't wrong about a single name in that chain. He simply had no way of knowing that written into his own cells was a second, deeper archive, one that recorded a history his oral tradition was never built to hold. Genealogy remembers names. Genomes remember migrations no one was left alive to name. So the real question was never which direction the DNA came from. It's what it means to call any single place, or any single people, the origin of anything. Widen the lens one final time, past Djibouti, past the Horn of Africa entirely. By mainstream population genetic consensus, every non-African person alive today descends from ancestors who passed through this same narrow corridor tens of thousands of years ago on their way out. The irony completes itself in the DNA of the people who stayed behind. Some portion of that outward-bound ancestry appears to have circled back, generations later, layering itself into the very land it once left, until leaving and returning became part of the same unbroken record. What counts as indigenous rarely turns out to be a single unbroken line, here or anywhere else. It's closer to sediment, layer stacked on layer, migration folding back over migration, each one settling at a different depth, none of them erasing the ones beneath. Pull a core sample from that ground and you don't find one story, you find several, pressed together, still readable, still disagreeing with each other in places. The science itself remains split. A 3,000-year trade migration, a 15 to 23,000-year-old pulse underneath it. The open possibility that part of the signal was never a migration at all, but something older still, misread through a lens that wasn't built to see it clearly. None of those explanations has been ruled out. None of them has fully won. Maybe that's the real discovery. Not a clean answer sitting at the bottom of the core sample, waiting to be pulled up and read in a single line, but a people standing at the exact hinge point of human history, made of layer after layer that never fully settled. A people who were never quite who we thought, and, like the ground beneath them, never quite finished forming.